My name is Ginevra. I'm the program director at Sustainable Woodstock. We were founded in 2009, and we are a nonprofit community and environmental action and education organization that builds on Woodstock's legacy as birthplace of the modern conservation movement. If you hear noises, that's a dog. Our vision promotes vibrant, inclusive, thriving communities where we live sustainably now and into the future. So you've come to our monthly green drinks. Green drinks are social events that are meant to connect people who have similar interests. We invite nonprofits, individuals, like in this case, and businesses to make short presentations highlighting sustainable initiatives in our area. And these green drinks are often virtual now, like this one. So we have the ability to record and share afterwards, which we will do. However, our next green drinks, to quickly plug it, is going to be in October. It's going to be October 4th, so early October, coming right up. And it's actually going to be an in-person forest carbon walk at the Hartford Town Forest, exploring the concept of forest carbon, how the town of Hartford is looking to enhance carbon sequestration and storage in the forest, and how landowners can pursue forest carbon on their property. So again, that's an in-person green drinks on October 4th in the Hartford Town Forest. Registration is live online, and I will send the link to register in a follow-up email to this event. All right, before we get started, I'm just going to quickly run through our meeting agenda and how this meeting will work. You are being recorded. I'm going to double check it. Yes, you are. So if you don't want your face to show on any recording, it'll mostly show our speaker, but you're welcome to turn your camera off. So just be aware of what's happening behind you. You're also currently muted. So if you have questions as our speaker, Rob, is speaking, please go ahead and type those in the chat box on Zoom. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom, you can put your cursor on the screen. And at the bottom, there's an option to hit chat box. If not, there's a ... more button. Click ... more, and you can get the chat open in that way. We'll ask those questions and save them until the Q&A. We'll leave plenty of time for Q&A though at the end. And otherwise, I will follow up with this recording, next month's event, and any contact info or links that Rob wants me to. And I think that that's all of our logistics. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Rob. Rob grew up in Wisconsin and trained as a chemist, earning a PhD in chemistry from MIT. He taught chemistry for 10 years at the University of Maine at Orono, and then worked for 10 years in pharmaceutical drug discovery at Glaxo Wellcome in North Carolina. He moved to Vermont in 2001. After taking a few years off to be an at-home dad, Rob joined the Vermont Institute of Natural Science and then left VINS to help join the Four Winds Nature Institute. He retired from Four Winds in 2017. He and his wife, Jennifer Grant, live in Heartland, where he is currently the chair of the Heartland Conservation Commission. Okay, I think that is all for me, Rob, so I will let you go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Ginevra, for the introduction, and thank all of you for coming. I call this thing that I've done a guide to long-range energy planning, and maybe I'll share my screen so we can see the slides. There, can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I call this thing a guide, and I have written about a 20-page guide that essentially says what I'll be saying tonight. But it's really also, you can think of it as sort of a travel log, because it's talking about a journey that Jennifer, my wife, and I set out on about a year and almost a year and a half ago now, to try to reduce the amount of carbon that we were generating in our lives. And so my hope is that this will encourage you to start thinking about your own journey and maybe begin to move in this direction as well. months. Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge several people who have helped in this process. Obviously, Jennifer, who has been the voice of reason. A lot of times I get carried away with my big ideas, and Jennifer's the one who brings me back to reality. Also, the Heartland Energy Committee, particularly Sarah Bruce and Ariel Arwin, Carl Kemnitzer, who have all read the guide and given me feedback. They've listened to my talk and given me feedback on that, and that's been extremely helpful. And finally, Tad Montgomery, who has also read the guide and given me feedback on it, and he continues to send me resources. In fact, he sent something yesterday that he thinks might be relevant or interesting or useful, and they almost always are. So let me start. I don't know why. There. So I want to start with a quote. This is one of those quotes you pull off the internet that aren't credited to any particular person, but this one I thought was helpful because it says, focus on where you want to go, not where you currently are. And I think that this is important, particularly when we're dealing with climate change, because the problem can be so overwhelming that if you think too much about it, you can just get paralyzed. And so this guide and the work that I've been doing is my way of trying to make some small steps that make me feel like I'm progressing. And I think that that's a really important thing, to just not sit there and do nothing, but to actually make some forward progress. This process, as I mentioned, started about 1.5 years ago. And at the time, there were a bunch of reports coming out about the federal and state governments setting aggressive targets for how we were going to reduce our carbon usage. And it got me thinking that we needed to do more than we were. You know, we've done some stuff. We put in a solar panel in 2015. We had an energy audit in 2018. We've replaced all of our light bulbs with LED bulbs, and we keep the thermostat turned down. But really, it didn't feel like we were having the kind of impact that we're going to need to meet these energy targets that both the state and federal governments are aiming for. So I started thinking about this as if it were a problem of overspending our money. And if we were overspending our money, we might go to a financial planner who would look at what we were doing and say, okay, here's what you need to do to reduce your spending, or here's what you need to do to make more money, or something that would help us through this process. And so I said, well, maybe we could find somebody like that to talk about energy with us. And somebody who would look at our whole lifestyle and would say, okay, here's what you need to focus on first, and then this next. But when I went looking for such a person, I couldn't find anybody that did that. You can find people who talk about electric vehicles, you can find people who talk about heat pumps, but somebody who looks at the whole picture was hard to find. And so Jennifer and I said, well, you know, how hard can that be? We'll just do it ourselves. And so we set out on this process. And the first thing I did was I started trying to list, okay, where are we using energy? And as you can imagine, that's a very long list. And rather than try to list every single thing, it became apparent that what I should be doing is trying to list sort of groups of things that I call energy systems. And so the first one of these, I said, well, you know, I have an electrical system in my house. It runs all of the appliances. It runs our lights and our computers and everything that gets plugged into the wall. So all of those things are my electrical system. By system here, I just mean a group of related activities that consume energy. And in our case, we have a solar panel as well. Heat is another home system. So warming and cooling our living space. We don't have any sort of air conditioning, but after this past summer, we're seriously thinking that we might want to look into something like that. And probably not air conditioning, but maybe a heat pump. So heat is going to be a big contributor to our energy footprint. Transportation is another one. We live in rural Vermont. We're miles from any kind of store or school or theater or hospital or pretty much anything. The place where we live is not very conducive to riding bicycles. And so a car is pretty much a necessity. And so transportation is another big contributor, another system that we want to look at. Food. And this, in my case here, I'm just going to be talking about our cooking. We can think of energy use as two different sorts. One is direct energy use, and one is indirect energy use. So, for example, with food, when I go to the store and buy a pound of hamburger and I bring it home, I cook it, and that takes energy. That's a direct, me using energy directly. But there's also a lot of indirect energy that goes into getting that hamburger into the store in the first place. So, depending on where it was raised, there was energy involved in raising the cattle, in processing the meat, in transporting the meat to the store. All of those pieces are indirect energy costs. And later down the road, I may take a look at those. But for the time being, I'm just going to focus on the direct energy use that I'm generating. So in this case, it's mostly cooking. Another system is around water. We have a well, so we pump water out of the well, and then we heat some of that water for showers and doing dishes and doing laundry. So those all require energy. Yard maintenance. So I have a lawn that I mow. I have a edge trimmer, a weed whacker that I use. If we did chainsaw work, those all require energy. So there's another system. Recreation. For Jennifer and I, most of our recreation is human powered. So it's riding our bikes, it's kayaking, it's hiking. And so the only energy cost there is getting to the place where we're going to kayak or hike, and that would fall under our transportation system. But if we had something like a snowmobile or an ATV or a jet ski or something that is powered, we would want to include that in our recreation system. And then our waste system. So in this one, again, it's mostly indirect costs, and I won't talk much more about it now, but it's certainly something that I want to think about in the future is when we take a load of stuff to the recycling center, there's energy involved in recycling and doing something with that, or the trash that we generate, all of those things, there are energy costs associated with them. So now I've divided all of my energy use that I could think of into a set of home systems. And now you could think of this, if we go back to the budgeting example that I talked about earlier, these are kind of like the budget categories, or the things, the areas where I'm spending my money. And now I have to try and figure out what to do with this. Now imagine if you were doing a budget and you bought your gas using dollars, and you paid the mortgage using ruples, and you bought your food with pesos, and everything that you spent was in a different currency. Trying to budget that way would make no sense at all, and it would be extremely clumsy and frustrating. The same thing is true here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to convert our energy use in each of these systems to some kind of a common unit. So we can pick any unit we like. There are some units that are actually measuring energy, like the British thermal unit, BTU, or joules. You could also express everything as kilowatt hours. But because what we were trying to do is focus on reducing our fossil fuel use, we opted to pick as our common unit pounds of carbon dioxide. And so now we want to go through and express everything from each of our systems in that unit, so pounds of carbon dioxide. And then we'll be able to start taking a look at where, where are we spending energy, how much are we spending? And as we make changes, this will allow us to see that the changes are having an impact. To do this, good record keeping is essential. And in fact, much of the first year that I was working on this plan, it was about trying to put in place systems for keeping better records. I had some idea of what we were using in terms of energy, but it wasn't clear enough and it wasn't accurate enough for the purposes that I was going to try and use it for. Another point that I want to bring up here is that consistency is at least as important as accuracy. And by that, I mean that, let's take gasoline, for example. If we wanted to express how many pounds of carbon dioxide do we generate when we burn a gallon of gasoline in our car, you can go to the internet and it's fairly easy to get some conversion factors. But then if you start thinking about, well, is it high test gasoline or is it the octane 87 stuff? Is it got alcohol in it? Does that make a difference? Does the temperature make a difference? Does how fast I'm driving make a difference? And probably the answer to all of those things is yes. But if I spend time trying to get exactly how many pounds per gallon I'm using, I'll be halfway through my energy plan and all I'll be doing is still getting conversion factors. The important thing is to pick a conversion factor and then use that consistently throughout your work. Because what we'll be ultimately trying to do is reduce the number of gallons of gasoline that we use, and that will automatically reduce the pounds of carbon dioxide that we're using. But we don't need to know with a great deal of accuracy what that carbon dioxide level is. So if I go back to my systems now, and I think about, okay, my electricity is in kilowatt hours. So I need to find a conversion factor that moves me from kilowatt hours to pounds of carbon dioxide. My transportation costs are in gallons of gasoline. I need to find something that converts to pounds of carbon dioxide, and so forth down through all of my systems. And so when I did this, I came up with a set of conversion factors. And then for each of the major systems that I'm looking at, I could estimate how much carbon dioxide I was generating in each system. Some of these are very rough estimates because as I mentioned earlier, I hadn't been keeping accurate enough records. But as I move forward now with some good record keeping in place, these estimates will get much closer to correct. So if I graph this, this is what the first pass looks like. Now these are numbers based on 2020 because that was the latest year that I had a full year's worth of data for. I've done this again in 2021, and we'll talk about that later on in the talk. But one of the really interesting things, let's see if I can get my cursor here. Look at that electrical line, right? So that was about 107 pounds of carbon dioxide for the entire year's worth of electricity. Now, what that tells me is that, yes, I can go around and turn off my electric lights when I'm not in the room. I can do, I can fiddle around a little with electric, but even if I cut my entire electric use out, I would not be saving all that much in terms of pounds of carbon dioxide. That 107 pounds represents about 5.5 gallons of gasoline. So it's not even a tank of gasoline. So that I thought was really an interesting thing, and I'll come back to that in just a minute. Yard maintenance, again, I was taking a guess here. Food, heat, as I would have predicted, heating my living space, heating hot water, and transportation are really the big contributors here. So if I'm going to cut down my pounds of carbon dioxide, these are the places where I should be looking. All right, so then I'll come back to this question of why is our electricity so low? And it turns out that we are sort of lucky because we live where we live. If we lived in West Virginia and we had a coal-fired power plant generating our electricity, we would be producing about 2.23 pounds of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour that we use. If we had a petroleum-fired plant, it's about 2.13 pounds. Natural gas is about 0.91 pounds. But Green Mountain Power, which is where we get our electricity, the portfolio of energy sources that they use is primarily hydropower and solar. And so the amount of carbon dioxide that they generate per kilowatt hour is only 0.038. That's their estimate. Now we could argue with, maybe they're not counting hydro as highly as they should, but even if they were wrong by a factor of 2, it's still a very small number relative to some of these other sources of producing electricity. Home solar, we would like to think of as being carbon free, but it's not, because there are carbon costs, there are indirect carbon costs with the mining of the materials and the producing of the solar panels themselves. So if you factor those in over the lifetime of a solar panel, it works out to about 0.013 pounds of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. And so if you compare the amount of carbon you produce with the Green Mountain Power portfolio to coal-fired power plants, that's about a factor of 60 times less carbon we're producing per kilowatt hour. Now, if we lived in West Virginia and I did that same map that you were just looking at, the bar for electricity would be one of the bigger ones in the graph. So just because we live where we live and the portfolio is the way it is, our carbon produced is very small for electricity. Okay, so now I want to go through each of my systems and I want to identify things that I can do that will reduce the amount of carbon dioxide I'm generating in that system. Now, this can come about in one of two ways. I can either reduce the energy use, or I can try and switch to a cleaner energy source. So for example, I might switch from fuel oil to electricity as a source of my whatever I'm using in that system. And if I do that, then my carbon dioxide will go down. So for example, under my heating system, I could do an energy audit. We've done one of these now in 2018, but that's an important first step if someone hasn't done that. I can insulate the house, I can weather strip around the doors and windows, I could replace the oil boiler with a heat pump. So these are all things that I can do that would bring down the amount of carbon dioxide I'm generating in my heating system. For my electrical system, it was very interesting when I started looking. Green Mountain Power actually can give you your energy use, your electricity use, hour by hour, 24/7, by just going to their website. And so one of the interesting things I learned when I went looking was that if we're gone, if we leave the house for several days, the house is still using a fair bit of energy. The refrigerator is still running. We have a radon remediation system that runs all the time. And so there are things that are always running. This is what I call base current here. So if I'm trying to reduce my carbon dioxide production, I may want to go through and look at every room. What are the electrical devices? Do I need those devices on? Is there a way that I could turn them on when I need them and turn them off again easily? Installing LED bulbs, etc. So I go through every one of my systems and I identify all of these steps, and then I combine them into a huge list, and bang, there's my energy plan. There's my long-range energy plan. But I'm going to have to prioritize this list because we're constrained by how much money we have, how much time we have. There's a lot of things involved here. If I won the lottery, I could just hand the list to a contractor and say, here, do all these things, and I'd be done. But we're not there yet. So we're going to prioritize these steps based on a number of things. Cost is obviously one. Time is another. How much effort is it to do this? And what kind of impact is it going to have on my carbon dioxide production? So in terms of cost, a lot of these devices that we might implement, so a heat pump, an electric vehicle, these things have a fairly high upfront cost, but they also come they often come with rebates or tax incentives at both the state and federal level. And so when I'm figuring out what do each of these steps cost, I want to make sure that I include those components into the cost. I want to consider how much carbon reduction this change is going to make, both as a total and as a per dollar I spent on making the change in the first place. So let me go back to this list or the graph that I showed you earlier. And I want to focus on two of these bars, the hot water heater bar here and the transportation bar. So our hot water runs off of the boiler, the same boiler that we use for heating our house in the winter. But we're using hot water all year round, and we're not heating the house all year round. The boiler has to stay on all year because it has to do that to keep our water hot. So we're running the boiler even though we're not heating the house, which seems unnecessary. If we replaced the water heater with an electric water heater, or in our case, what we chose to do was a heat pump hot water heater, we can reduce this bar from, this is about 9,000 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. We can reduce that down to, something comparable to this electrical one. So it's going to be a very small blip. It's actually something like a 95 or 96% reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide we're using. So for the $3,500 it would cost us to install this water heater, we're getting about a 9,000 pound reduction of carbon. With transportation, if we went to an electric vehicle, we could remove most of this 11,000 pound bar, and we could make that a very small bar down here for electric. But that would cost us 10 times as much, right? So an electric vehicle might be $30,000, $35,000. So if I'm trying to prioritize these, I would say, let's do the water heater first, because for a tenth of the cost, that's going to give me almost the same reduction in carbon. So that's what I mean by looking at the impact of the change you're making on your carbon footprint. We also want to look at the savings that a change might bring over the expected lifetime of the thing that you did. So I'll take the water heater again as an example. I'm estimating that we use about 400 gallons of fuel oil every year to heat our hot water. At $5 a gallon, that's about $2,000 that we're spending. If we switch to this heat pump, excuse me, if we switch to the heat pump, we spend much less. It's like maybe $150 in electricity. So I'm saving something over $1,800 a year in making this change. So if I can come up with the money to do the $3,500 investment, in 2 years' time, I've saved enough for that hot water heater to have paid for itself. The savings continue after that for the lifetime of the water heater. So I don't know if that's going to be 10 years or 15 years, but that's a $1,800 savings in my pocket every year that I can use to invest in other energy saving changes. So I want to look at this when I'm prioritizing these steps. I want to think about how long is the payback time for this kind of an investment. For my solar panel, another example, we got the solar panel in 2015, and based on its track record to this point, it looks like about an 11-year time frame, and then it will have paid for itself, and then the remaining 14, 15 years of its lifetime, that money is just, that's free money for us. So you want to take a look at this cost savings that you might get. Finally, a thing that you might want to think about, in all of these areas, the technology is changing quickly. So if you look at electric vehicles, they're getting better every year, they're getting cheaper every year. If you look at heat pumps, they're getting better every year, they're getting cheaper every year. And so you might say to yourself, well, maybe I should wait. And if I wait for 5 years, the technology will be better, they'll be cheaper. And so that might be an approach that you would take. Unfortunately, I think because of the crisis situation that we're in, we can't really afford to sit around and wait for things to get better. And so my answer to this one, when is the best time to buy? I think the answer is probably as soon as you can, as soon as you can afford to just go ahead and do it, because we don't really have 5 years to sit around and wait to make these changes. Okay, so the next thing, now I've made this huge list of steps, and I've gone through and I've looked at each step and I've said, okay, what's the priority here? How important is it? How much impact will it have? What will it cost? Now what I want to do is set up a timeline. And in the very beginning, I had set 10 years. That's the time frame that I want us to be reaching the end of our plan. And so my target is to have everything on my list finished by that 10-year period. I want to spread out the cost of the big items so that I have time to save up some money. I may need to borrow money. I can look for low interest loans. Actually, I was looking this morning, and Efficiency Vermont has a bunch of banks and financial institutions that they have worked with who will, depending on your income, generate either low interest or no interest loans. And so a lot of these projects, you can borrow the money, and if the energy savings are sufficient, you can pay off the loan with the energy savings, and it won't actually cost you anything to be doing this. Or it won't have the impact that you might think. The other thing I want to do in this timeline is there are some projects that are really big and daunting. And so rather than try and treat them as one big project, I would break them down into smaller steps. So instead of just saying, I'll insulate the house, I might break that down into, okay, my first step is I'm going to go around and caulk around all the windows and doors. Then I'm going to put insulation in the attic. Then I'm going to put some weather stripping in. I might replace leaky windows. All of these are part of insulating the house. But when I break them down, it doesn't seem quite so daunting. What you'll find when you start doing this is that the things that you're going to do in the next year or two are fairly clear. And beyond that, it gets a little murkier, and you say, well, I might do the EV in year 3, and I might do the heat pump in year 5, but by the time you get to year 3 or 5, things may have changed. And so really what you want to focus on, you want to be sure that you've gotten everything somewhere in the plan in your 10-year target period, or whatever your target period is. But keep in mind that the timeline is going to adjust as you move through it. The death of any long-range plan is to do it and then put it on the shelf and forget about it. And so this may be the most important part of this plan, is to review your plan regularly and adjust it as you need to. I do this once a year. I do it in January because then I have all of the numbers for how much energy I used in each of my systems for the last 12-month period. So I will go through and calculate my energy use for each system for that year, and I'll redraw that graph that I showed you earlier and see how am I doing? How have I done in the progress toward my goals? If I'm achieving the steps that I had set out, then I want to pat myself on the back and give myself a little reward. If I didn't, it's important to understand why was that? Was I too aggressive in setting the goal? Did I come into some unusual circumstance that prevented me? So assessing my progress toward the goals. Then I want to go through each system again, and I want to look at those steps that I had identified last year and say, do these still make sense? Are there different steps I should put in? Have I achieved some so I can take some steps out? And I want to have sort of a rolling system of looking at the steps in each of my systems that will reduce my carbon dioxide. And then I'll set goals for the next year, or maybe the next 2 years. And so this is an important part of the planning, is to review the plan and adjust it as you need to. As you're going through this, this year, for example, we've gotten some estimates of some of the things that we wanted, some of the changes we would like to make. And those estimates were different than I had expected. And so it's causing me then to relook at the steps that I was suggesting in the time frame and say, well, should I try and break this up? Should I do part of the step? Should I do this step before that step? And so you wanted to look at that, your sort of plan for the next year. I will end with another quote here. This was actually from a colleague of mine up at the University of Maine. Don't tell me why it can't be done. Tell me how it can be done. It's very easy when you set out on something like this, or when you hear about somebody else's plan, to find reasons why, oh, that won't work, or this should be done different. And that's okay if the goal is that you are going to come up with a better plan yourself and you're actually going to do something. Rather, if if what you're doing is just saying, oh, that can't be done, or oh, that's too expensive, then you're defeating yourself. You're giving up on it. And so if it looks like it can't be done, figure out how it can be done. Okay, so let me make sure that I haven't forgotten anything. Yeah, so one of the things that you'll discover when you do this is that it starts to change the way you look at the world. And you start thinking about everything that you do. How does this impact my carbon dioxide production? And that's a wonderful change, because I think that that's the sort of change that we need in everybody to really get at this climate change crisis. I was telling Michael before we started that yesterday I was out cutting the lawn, and as I was cutting it, I was thinking, I wonder if there's a better way I could cut the lawn that would use less gasoline. And I came in and I was drawing little pictures, and I think I came up with something that now I want to test out and see. It may be able to save me as much as 20% on the gasoline I'm using for cutting the grass. And it's just little things like that that you discover will have an impact. So I have, as I mentioned, I have this guide. I have a 2-page summary of the guide, and I have a checklist that goes along with it. And I also have the slides that I used today. I will send all of those to Ginevra. And so if anybody wants to look at any of that, just get in touch with her, tell her what you want. I also, Ginevra obviously has my contact information. And if anybody wants to talk to me in more detail about their particular situation or things that we've done that I glossed over, I'm happy to talk more to anyone. So again, just contact Ginevra and she can put you in touch with me. So I think that's all I have, and I'm open to any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Rob. And yes, definitely contact me. I can send out the guide to everyone who is registered for this event as an attachment, if that's helpful. So folks just get it automatically, and I can send any other info you'd like. It's very, I get the sense that you're a very practically minded person. I love the kind of deliberative nature that you've gone through each of these steps and each of these systems in your home. So thank you for presenting all that.
A lot of the practicality is Jennifer, I have to confess.
You're the vision, maybe. Yeah, really great. So Michael and I can get on here now and take questions. I see Robin said, yes, please do. I'm assuming this is sending out the guide. Okay, so I will certainly do that. Let's start. I'll start off with the first one here. How many rebates, tax incentives, and other forms of cost breaks have you been able to leverage while implementing your many energy saving and sustainable household projects? And which did you find the most effective or helpful?
Yeah, so when we did the solar panel in 2015, there was almost a 30% tax break on that. So the cost, instead of being full cost, we were paying about 70% of the cost. So that was a huge one. We also get an incentive from Green Mountain Power, although those incentives are much less now than they were in 2015. But for every kilowatt hour that we generate and send back to GMP, we get paid some incentive money on that. So that was a big one. The heat pump hot water heater, I think we got about $400 back on that from Efficiency Vermont. Efficiency Vermont, if you're not familiar with them, they have a lot of information about this. And So if you go to their website and just look around, I mentioned the thing about low interest loans. They also have all the information about rebates and tax incentives. That's all there. The other source of this is the contractors who do the work. So when you bring somebody in and they give you an estimate for what would it cost to put a heat pump in here instead of my fuel oil boiler, they can tell you, here's what you can expect in terms of rebates and tax incentives. This new law that's just been recently passed, the IRA, which I can't remember what it means, but it's just been in the last couple of weeks that the federal government passed this law. There are going to be a lot of implications in there for tax incentives and other kinds of trying to encourage people to do carbon reducing changes in their lifestyle.
Yes, thank you. Definitely. That 30% tax credit for solar is going to be coming back, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's great.
So that would be what you essentially got back when you did your solar.
Right.
If anyone's interested. Now's the
Another
time.
question, Rob, that I had was, do you have the guide that you created as a digital document that can be shared, or?
I have the guide. So essentially, everything I said today, and probably a little more, is in a guide. It's about a 20-page document that Ginevra said she would send out to people. So I do have that. There's also a lot of other resources that as you start exploring, you will discover things that you never dreamed of.
Thank you. We have another question here. Our family had a heat pump at our last home and we loved it, but the electric bill was $400 a month. The home was not that well insulated. I'm saving up for a heat pump in our new home to replace propane. Any advice welcome on how to contain electric costs? Solar panels maybe at the end of the 10-year plan, installation maybe this year.
Yeah, well, so in any heat-related thing, insulation is your best way to go, because if you're not wasting energy, then that's working in your advantage. So having an energy audit, doing insulation. When I had the energy audit, one of the things they told me is just go around your house with a caulk gun and plug up all the little holes around the windows and around the window sills. And, it made a big difference. We did one little insulation project in our mudroom, and then I went around with a caulk gun and did a bunch of work there. And our energy costs the next year were about 20% lower. And so that's not, doesn't take a lot of money to go around and caulk your windows and doors. But keeping the heat that you generate in the house is, that's the big one. The other thing is the same that you would do with any heating system is, keep the thermostat low. In the winter time, you want to, put on an extra sweater. In the summertime, keep the thermostat high so that you're not with a heat pump. Actually, it cools your house in the summer if you ask it to, and it heats your house in the winter if you ask it to. And so just put up with a little discomfort. You don't have to have it be ice cold in the summer and blazing hot in the winter. So, lifestyle is another key part of this.
Thank you. And yeah, weatherization is a great tip. Do you want to ask the next question, Michael?
Yeah, I was just actually typing that Linda Gray had shared the calculator about what incentives are available and financial incentives through the new Energy Act. I just was typing that into an email so we could save it to send out to people because it looks really good.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah. So which question are we on here?
I've got the one from Carla Kimball. I can read it if you want. I've got it in front of me.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you for this. Very thoughtful and useful. Does the guide you've created include your conversions to pounds of CO2?
Yes. Now, we don't use wood anywhere. And so if you burn wood for heating, either in the form of like a wood stove or a pellet stove, I don't have conversion factors in there, but they're pretty easy. If you go on the web, you can find conversion factors. And once you get something that's reasonably close, as I mentioned, just use it and use it consistently, and don't worry too much about, is it 5% off some way? So just go ahead and do it. But the
Teresa?
conversion factors that I used are in the guide.
Okay, great. Teresa's asking, I recently got an electric battery lawnmower. I don't have to use gasoline, but now I use more electricity. Is it really a savings?
Yes, and this is a really good question, because if you were living in West Virginia, the answer would probably be no. But if you're living in Vermont, because of the portfolio of energy sources that Green Mountain Power uses, the answer is probably yes. I mentioned in the slide with the graph, right? My entire energy consumption for the year is less than 5.5 gallons of gasoline. And so with my mower, I probably am using 3 or 4 gallons a year to mow the lawn. So if my energy cost will go up some, but it's not going to double if you look at all of the things that I'm using electricity for. And so I think that the trade-off is actually that you will save. You'll certainly save in terms of carbon, and I think you'll probably save in terms of money as well.
So I'll just follow up, Rob. You said if you compared living in West Virginia versus Vermont, I think probably everybody knew what you were alluding to, but I'll just ask you what exactly would make that difference.
Right. It's because in West Virginia, I'm guessing that they generate their electricity by burning coal. And so in addition to all the other nasty things coal puts into the air, it generates a lot of carbon per kilowatt hour. Whereas if you're using hydropower or solar, you're producing much less carbon per kilowatt hour.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I did put a link in here to Mow Electric, which is a Vermont website on electric lawn care. And there are some great numbers that he breaks down on for commercial lawnmowers, but you can kind of think of it in your own terms, in terms of how much money you're saving and how much carbon. And it's really useful. There are also rebates on electric lawn equipment. So definitely look those up.
Yeah, that was a great talk from the fellow from Mow Electric recently.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you could come.
Yeah, he talked a lot about, and it's not only the gasoline use, but the maintenance costs on an electric mower are a lot less, and an electric car too.
We have an electric mower that was donated by an anonymous donor, and also with Woodstock Hardware chipping in some, but we use it at our community garden. And not only is it low maintenance and easy to put a charge, it lasts 45 minutes. We do the whole garden area, but electric motors have very strong power or torque at a low RPM. So unlike most gas mowers, which if you get into thick, high grass, they'll start really slowing down and sometimes stall, and you'll have to clean out the bottom. The electric mower kind of goes right through a lot of that really thick stuff much better than an electric mower. So that's a really real plus too.
Yeah, and we have comments on how they're quieter and how they can go a while on charge here, which I've also found with my weed whacker. I was gonna ask, since I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, so feel free to enter them. I was just gonna ask, what's next in your immediate future for your home, so everyone can hear.
Yeah, so one of the things that we had to look at early on was our electrical system. Because if you're going to put a lot of new stuff on your electric, you need to make sure that your electric system can handle it. And one of the problems that we've run into is that our electric service is 100 amps. A lot of the newer homes are 200 amps, but ours was not built that way. And so as you start putting more and more things, if you put heat pumps and heat pump hot water heaters and electric vehicle charging, if you put all of that stuff in, you have to seriously look at your electric system and try and balance, because you can't ever exceed 100 amps or you'll blow your fuse. So you might have to think about, well, I can only charge my electric vehicle at night, or I can only run the dryer in time periods where I'm not doing something else that's using a lot of heat. So one of the things we've looked at is, could we upgrade to a 200 amp service? That would give us a lot more flexibility about adding things. The jury is still out on that. It would be very expensive for us to make that upgrade, but it may limit us if we don't make the upgrade. It may limit us as to what we can do. We're looking at heat pumps. The fellow that came and talked to us said our house would be best served by having two different systems, one that worked on one side of the house, one that worked on the other side of the house. And so that actually gives us some flexibility, because we can say, maybe instead of doing both of them at the same time, we can do one first and then put off doing the other one for a while. And so there are, I think that the big things for us are the electrical system, looking at heat pumps, and looking at an electric vehicle.
I really think your focus on the nuances of all of this is really wonderful, because it does make a huge difference. I'm thinking about your saving 20% of energy by doing a different mowing pattern. Like some kind of a program where somebody could like plot out their yard on something, and then it would show them a mowing pattern that would save energy and be more efficient, But it really does make a difference.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rob. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, and we're at 6:30 actually. So
Thank you,
really
Rob.
appreciate your time. And I'll be in touch. I'll send out the info to everyone who attended and who signed up, and we'll get this recording on YouTube.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.